Well, hello everybody. Here we are at MindScience TV with another really interesting interview. I've been waiting a while to talk to Brent, but Brent Potter is a fabulous author. He's a clinician and has been for the last 19, 20 years, I think. He's also very much involved in Langian, and let me see, he's the director of the Society for Langian Studies and the R.D. Lang Institute. So everybody go out there and look up Lang if you don't know him, because he's a fascinating guy. But it's my great pleasure to have this conversation with Brent about his absolutely fascinating book, amongst other things, which he will tell us a bit more about right now. So here we go. G'day, Brent. That's how the Australians say it.
That's fantastic. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Look, you brought this book out in, it was about a year ago now, I think.
Right.
Let's tell us a bit. Title, because it's a fascinating title. I didn't want to sort of give it away. Fascinating title, and actually there's a lot of really current importance. It's become a little bit more heightened right at this present time for a number of reasons. So let's have you, let's have me shut up and you talk a bit.
Well, the book is called Elements of Self-Destruction, and it's an edited version of my dissertation when I was at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And what I was interested in doing there is I had been working in community mental health, private practice, et cetera, but really been working with some pretty distressed clients, and so I had that background. And then I remember I was studying for my comps. And so I had to memorize a lot of the DSM and was going through all that for the tests. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, if I could boil down these diagnoses to a few common features, what would those be? And I thought for a while, well, they're all kind of obsessive and they're all kind of compulsive. And I thought about that and then ran into this anxiety kind of the way, depression, psychosis. And so I would think about it that way. And then it occurred to me that there are lots of behaviors that we all have that are a little bit obsessive, a little bit compulsive, but are not labeled as a mental illness at all. In fact, those very qualities are applauded in, let's say, graduate students or people who write obsessively or do any athletics or a number of different things with those features. That's applauded. And then I thought, you know, what is the thing that really makes these something that others want to diagnose? And it occurred to me that it was destructiveness, that these things had to have a common feature of some kind of self-destructiveness going on, or self-destructiveness projected outwards as violence. And so from there, I just kind of, it was an intuitive idea and I just kind of ran with it. And sure enough, I think that I was onto something. So then I started to unfold it, because the phenomenon of destructiveness, sort of like a lot of different phenomena, it can either be everything or nothing. It's like looking at being, or looking at psyche, or looking at these different things. And so I was like, how do I unpack this, or how do I look at this? And so I found out that the only way to really look at it was through different lenses. And so one of them was historical and religious. So I was interested in, you know, did people always have to deal with this phenomenon of destructiveness? Or if that makes sense, and if so, how? And so I went back and I looked at religion in particular, because religions tend to, perhaps less so these days, but in the past really kind of provide containers for people's lives and how to live and what to do and not do.
I try and look everything very holistically. I like everywhere down from the body down to the cellular level, and I do work with the DNA and what we call psychosocial genomics. And this nature of the biology that seems to be almost a part of an organizing principle of the complex systems which we look in, is that we hold it together and proceed, or we decide it's not being held together and we get rid of it. And right down to a cellular level, where we turn off survival in preference for the management of other parts of the body. So this destructiveness is everywhere.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that all of these are attempts at survival. I mean, everything that we consider self-destructive is an attempt to survive in a paradoxical way. And there are a lot of different ways to think about it. I mean, I've got 3 more books coming out. One of them's on borderline personality disorder that I co-authored with Jacqueline Gunn. And in there, one of the things that I look at is it's kind of like Theodore Milan, who led the research team for Access to and established personology and all that. He used he used a few different metaphors, but one that was particularly interesting to me of a immune system. So, for example, the immune system essentially is designed to ward off and to get rid of the bad invasive things, and thus it keeps the body healthy. But with something like an autoimmune disease, the blood cells don't know whether to attack the good or the bad or both or sometimes everything. And that's kind of like, I think that's where trauma and personality disorders and other forms of distress can kind of be thought of that way, where it's like it's an attempt to survive, but after a while, it's difficult to differentiate the good from the bad, so to speak. And so everything is kind of attacked equally. And there are a lot of different ways to think about it, but they're all attempts at survival. They're all attempts at aliveness.
I think that's lovely. The immune system is really interesting. I did this degree where when I went into all the background of the biochemicals and all that, it was a bit crazy, but it was very informative. But I was fascinated to see the immune system. Its first response is just to get rid of everything that doesn't look right. Then its
right.
Then its second response is to then get specific and double check that all those things are actually appropriate to get rid of. And you just have this tiny little marker that is or isn't there, and the immune system just goes choose. So this idea of self-destructiveness as a viable option is what I find really interesting. And I get is that something? I imagine that's something that you're addressing through the book of that. Sometimes it seems like a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely I address it. And I don't argue also in the book that it is inherently a bad thing either. It raises the whole, because the first thing that comes to mind obviously is suicide.
Yeah.
And the more like apparent ways that people self-destruct. And as I was looking at that, especially in the history of like religion and culture, it raises a lot of ethical questions. It seems like almost at every turn or any way that I would look at the different lenses, whether it's history, religion, the schools of thought, psychoanalysis, regular psychology, whatever, that it almost always bumps up against a kind of ethical edge, or it teeters on a kind of moralism where there's a temptation to be drawn in to say, well, this is good or this is bad or this is right or this is wrong. And I did the best I could to just kind of stick with the experience without labeling it either way, and to just try to be faithful to it.
Now, it's one of the things that I got a little idea I call the winner-loser world theory, but essentially what it says is one of our problems is right and wrong and good and bad, which leads to the concept of fault and blame, which leads to the avoidance of responsibility, because we've made responsibility, instead of the growing capacity to respond, it's actually who's at fault and who's wrong, who pays, who loses, who suffers. And so it's not that we want people, I'm sure you're not, and I know you're not, advocating that there's nothing wrong with suicide or that. It's just that, first of all, let's just look at what it is.
Right.
And not try and get stuck. Yeah.
Yeah, and I say that repeatedly in the book, that it's really important to look at it squarely in the eye and just descriptively before we get it. So that way, at least we have all the information before we go into some place of how do I feel about that, and then how do I conduct myself based upon my beliefs or morals around that. I think it's important first to look at the whole phenomenon itself, and so we have all of the information before making those kind of moral decisions. And also moralism in general is something that's a red flag for me, because with moralism, usually it falls along the lines, and James Hillman and R.D. Laing were both followed this kind of, or talked about this line of reasoning where there's me and then my group, and we're good. And then there's people out there, and if we're good, then they're necessarily bad.
That's right.
And so if I'm good and they're bad, I'm good and they're evil, then it limits my ability to relate in the sense that we have to destroy things that are evil. James Hillman talked a lot about that. R.D. Laing definitely talked a lot about that. And so moralism leads to a kind of a bifurcation or literalism in thinking, and is something to be avoided, I think.
Well, so Jonathan Haidt's talking about this at the moment. He does a lot on morality.
Oh, really?
And yeah, he's talking. Wow. Yeah, he's talking about the extreme polarization of opinion that's going on, where that central area where even those who have very different opinions could have some point of okay, well, I agree with that. That we're polarizing, particularly the political arena and the socio-political arena, so that everybody who doesn't have my opinion is wrong, and everybody who does have my opinion is right, and there's no middle
Coincidentally,
ground.
I'm always right though in the equation, right?
Well, this is the wonderful gag of the boss sitting at the thing. So I've gathered all you experts here just to make sure you give me good advice, but realizing of course that I'm right. Yeah. But Jonathan Haidt says he's got a lovely talk called "We Need an Asteroid." Meaning we need an asteroid to be falling on the Earth, and maybe we'll all just find some common cause for survival.
Well, Heidegger said only a God can save us, and he meant that in all seriousness. And he didn't think. I'm not sure that he felt like there was really any hope for it. I don't share that opinion, but something I'm interested in writing more about in the future is because it keeps coming up that. Anytime there's something with an affective charge to it, I'm seeing more and more that the mind, perhaps the American mind in particular, really bifurcates. It just goes good, bad, right, wrong, and this very, very powerful, literalistic, simplistic thinking, when in fact, in my experience anyway, and working with clients and reality is multivariant. It's all kinds of shades of gray, and it's not just objective reality, like things that are hard and extended in space. It's also affective, emotional reality. It's psychic reality. It's social reality. And there's a kind of pathos going on right now with a very ill world, and the mind's capacity or incapacity actually to tolerate ambivalence and difference and variation. And I see that more and more, that these two kind of pathologies seem to mirror and resonate with each other, but it's very powerful. This everything that's brought up with an affective charge, guns, abortion, war in the Middle East, anything that has an affective charge, education. It doesn't even have to be that extreme. Education, everyone has an opinion like that, and they're on one side and they're automatically against another side. And there's absolutely no, it's like a thought is murdered in the process. And I don't think that this is just people's capacity or incapacity. I think it's a real kind of disturbance or destructive mood in the world right now.
Yeah, I've a few discussions on this. One of the thoughts, I'd like to have your thoughts on this, but we've taken away the capacity and the interest in contemplation, in consideration, in that time of pause after something, where we sit cross-legged and allow the meaning to come to us. The meaning, as you say, is just this. You're with me or you're against me. It's tough.
There are a lot of politicians that say that. I was going to mention, but you hear that a lot in the political discourse. Either you agree with me or you're anti this or that. I write a lot about that in this first book, and I write about it in the one that follows too. I'm really interested in, and Heidegger and Bion both talk about this in different ways. Heidegger really, especially in his later work, was interested in looking at the destructiveness in the world, which has to do with kind of a technological disclosure of things. And Bion really looks at the same phenomenon, but he's doing it from the point of view of the mind. He's a psychoanalyst. And so it's interesting. I kind of paralleled those two in the book to see how they both kind of track each other, even though they didn't know each other. But it has to do with the attack on thinking Bion talks about, where the capacity for thought isn't just lazy, like it's just humming along, not really doing much. Not thinking is actually anti-thinking. The way the mind attacks itself and takes itself apart, and then how we see that in reality outside of how we're taking things apart. And I think it has to do with capacity. I think it has to do with the quality of experience, and that's where Heidegger and Bion both are, is with qualitative reality, which they consider fundamental, and quantitative is not considered like really real in the philosophy language.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to read up on Heidegger and Bion, because it's really interesting, the stuff. And everybody, I'm not going to explain it, and go read. Everybody, go read his book. You know, go read Brent's book. But what's interesting is too what you're doing here with this philosophical introduction. There's Ian McGilchrist's books just brings that to mind, of the Master and his Emissary. Is very philosophical and very much going into culture and very much so, you know, very neurobiological. So for all my neurobiology people out there, it's really important for us, once we get the biology going and understanding it, that if we haven't been into philosophy, I think it's really important we go there, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you.
Well, yeah, I don't, I, as a phenomenologist, or from that perspective, you know, we see basically the body, which would include the central nervous system, as an expression of our existence, as a secondary, or I don't want to say secondary, that sounds kind of Cartesian, but sort of following Maynard Boss, you know, our bodies and our brains are, you know, that's an expression of our existence. And so the qualitative, a reality is qualitative, or there's a sort of ontological meaning and ground to that. And then, you know, we have physiological expression of that. And so following from that, my interest in whether it's borderline personality disorder or psychosis or any of this phenomena is I don't believe that they exist in the individual's mind, specifically somehow located in a chemically imbalanced or otherwise malfunctioning brain organ. I see them as social constructions and as existential ways of being in the world, but I don't deny that they cause people distress. And so whenever I'm looking at something like anxiety, depression, psychosis, what's often labeled as personality disorder, I always look to the cultural narrative of it, and I always find something fascinating. There is a whole entire story around every single one of these phenomena that are out there. If you read it in the context of history and culture, there's a story to it that explains how it arrived here to us today in 2014. But it does not exist as an objective fact, like gravity or something objectively present in nature. It's a social construction for the most part, and it represents ways that people are in the world that are disclosed to them by culture. To say otherwise would be to say that people create these things ex nihilo, somehow out of nothing. And I just find that really unconvincing. And so in a lot of ways, I'm interested in seeing how people take up these possibilities that are disclosed to them, or don't take up these possibilities, and if so, why? And I think that the broader context within the kind of social, cultural, historical view is pretty convincing that there is a lot to do with trauma and protracted developmental stress and what that does to people. So all these areas connect together, but I look at it always from a very qualitative perspective, never from simply somehow a neurological malfunctioning of some kind.
Yeah, and I think this one of the areas I'm very involved in is interpersonal neurobiology. Dan Siegel and Alan Shaw and Lou Cozzolino and Bonnie Badenoch, those sorts of people. And one of the things which I really latched onto was this idea of engaging with the whole system as a complex system,
Right.
That when you have behavior, you have biology and you have neurobiology, and when you have neurobiology and biology, you have behavior, and all these things aren't causal; they aren't in a line. And the point of a complex system is you just, wherever you poke it, you're going to have some engagement with the system. And
Right.
so even if there's people out there who are saying, oh, of course there's neurobiology, uh, yeah, of course there's everything. And that's the point. There is everything. And
Mm.
what is interesting to me is that we need to take a moment to pause and focus in on one particular uh, point for a little while, not just go poking,
Well,
here and
right,
there.
right. Or rather than if someone comes to see me, rather than rolling in there with the assumption that biology causes behavior, or that this person talking to me is somehow the product of neurochemical electrical activity, I can look at them as a whole person.
Mm, mm,
And I see these things as not just somehow accidentally fitting together,
yeah.
but someone's existence, or Heidegger called it Dasein, that someone's Dasein is already a fundamental unity pointing towards capital B being,
Mm,
which includes all the things that he outlines and I outline. And but that person, you're right, is fundamentally whole. And if they come in even with something that could be considered a somatic complaint or something like that, the idea is, instead of having an agenda or trying to put my views of people on the client, what I'm doing is I'm meeting them where they're at, and I'm sticking with their experience.
mm,
So if the way in is a somatic complaint, then I stick with that experience. Or if it's a mood, then I stick with that experience. Or if it's a series of unwelcome recollections, startle response, or something that might be PTSD or something, that I stick with that experience. The idea, at least in the way I do it, is to stick with the clients themselves without, like Vion talked about, approaching every session without memory, desire, or understanding. And I don't want to take that too literally, like you just don't understand anything. But I think the point he's getting at
yeah.
is like you go in and try to see the person anew each session, and try to work with the whole person. As a matter of fact, I work with a non-prescribing physician,
Mm-hmm.
and Christine Bradley, and she does a brilliant job of attending to the domains that I just don't cover
Mm,
in my work with people. But the idea is to utilize a holistic approach with people. And I dare say, some of my colleagues wonder why I say this, but it's like, I don't know that psychotherapy it's not magic. And I don't think it's for everyone. Quite frankly, I've seen people improve drastically with nutrition.
mm-hmm.
I've seen in adolescent populations, there are programs like in Washington, Animals as Natural Therapy,
Mm,
where they're out and they're with horses. I've seen drastic improvement happen there. There's improvement sometimes through spiritual experience, religious experience. There's just a whole variety of things, and we have to stick with the symptoms, attend to the person as a whole entity, and I think that that's the best way to go, without any prejudice that one theory or one modality is somehow superior to the others.
Yeah, very, very Ericksonian, I suppose. Milton Erickson was the early one on this type of aspect, and Ernie Rossi, who's very kindly has me under his wing a bit, but he talks about the symptom path to enlightenment. Uh, I kind of modern verbalize it. I call it the problem as a message. And these
Mm-hmm.
sorts of ideas, yes, you can see how I'm a bit more straightforward. But these sorts of ideas of approach where actually the other person is providing the information about themselves, as different from us stepping forward into this wonderful, as a therapist, be it a doctor, be it a whatever, saying, ah, yes, I have the cure for
I've
you.
got it. Right. Yeah.
And it's amazing how I just did something recently, and I was actually admonished a little bit by somebody in the workshop, saying that I'd left the client and not attended to them, and so I had to go in and do this and do that. And I was very nice and polite, but what I wanted to say was, oh, wow, thank you so much for saving the day. You know, we,
Thank God you're here. Otherwise,
yeah,
yeah.
God knows what would have happened. Anyway, interesting stuff.
Well, I think that kind of the trajectory following, and it's not just Bion and Heidegger. There are others. Jung was really adept at this too. There's kind of like a Keats notion of negative capability, or there's a kind of, they had a sensibility about them of being in the unknown, and a real sense of that we're kind of always in the unknown
Mm.
in some ways, and to not have to feel the compulsion to fill a space with meaning, to fill something with meaning, to just be in the unknown, whether it's with a client or whether in just one lives his or her life. There's an emphasis there, and that really seems to be something that's unique to them and just completely ignored today, how to be in the unknown. And, with contemporary, especially STEM, natural science models, there is such a rush to fill everything with research and meaning and my opinion. And I mean, you just have to turn on the TV or listen to the radio, whatever, and it's people just rushing in to fill in space with just banter. And, what about the unknown? And like how you mentioned, what about contemplation?
Mm.
What about taking a minute? What about breathing? What about, I recommend yoga to some of my clients, and I've started kind of doing a little bit of it myself. Just those spaces of breathing, of not thinking so much, is just in our society just obliterated these days. And along with it, of course, like the humanities, literature, art, all of that stuff, because it's not productive and doesn't,
Yeah, I mean, Bessel van der Kolk is doing a lot of that now, talking about yoga as a part of the thing, which is interesting, of trauma reduction, and the somatic therapies. People like Peter Levine and Pat Ogden, they're being listened to a lot more. I mean, people are still saying, "Oh, you can't touch people," which is just weird. But but
Artie Lang said, I think people stop acting insane when you stop treating them like they're insane. It's about, whether they're clients or not, just treating them the same way, with the same way that we would treat anyone else. And, if that involves an occasional hug or some kind of somatic intervention, then that's perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, Patch Adams was very much like,
Right.
If you're sick, come stay with me for a couple of weeks and we'll sort something out. Which is always interesting. Now,
Lang did the same thing.
I was going to
He
say,
brought patients in,
I'd like to hear a bit more about some of the Langian stuff. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, Lang was a huge sort of presence. I can remember it really well. I didn't pursue it. I mean, you did, which is beautiful. What are some of the thoughts? I mean, in relation to the book, but also just this Langian idea. It's a real way of doing things. I'm interested.
Yeah, he was fascinating. He's always been. There's a section on him in the book, I think, called "Understanding Schizophrenia in a Psychotic Culture," or something like that. Whether I'm explicitly talking about him or not, he is a quiet background presence. Always in my writing. I knew I was going to be doing something in psychology. Like even in 6th or 7th grade, I remember asking my mom, because I was always interested in dreams. I was kind of an introverted kid. And I asked her, I was like, wouldn't it be interesting if there's someone, what are dreams? And like, you could talk to someone about, and she was like, oh, they're called psychologists. And so I got the phone book and I went to P and just started calling people on the rotary phone back in the day. And a few of them answered. And one of them said, I don't know about all of that, but there's this guy, Sigmund Freud, that you should look up. And I did that, and I started reading Freud. And the next kind of moment was Lang for me, because I learned a lot about Freud and psychoanalysis, and I found it really engaging. But I had this idea, what if we just treated people the same way that we wanted to be treated and brought that? Like we remembered the rules that like Freud talked about, like I was a kid thing, but we just kind of are with people. And it wasn't until I was at Duquesne and Dan Burston there gave us the divided experience that I was in my little apartment then in the bathtub reading The Divided Self, and I read it twice in the bathtub. I read it twice there. It's the only time that's ever happened. I was just so fascinated with, because he did that precisely, and just so well, that it was like a bell rang. It was like my experience first with Freud, and I took that with me, and then really just started reading more and more of him. And I've spoken to some of his former patients. I've spoken to some of his family, a lot of his colleagues over, gosh, a long time now, just kind of in pursuit of, because of course I never met him. I was born in 1975. I'm
Right.
39. Um,
Youngster.
in, pers- in pursuit of trying to figure out who he was. But everyone says the same thing. And this is really interesting, that, at least to me, that people say, when I talk to Artie Lang, even if I was in a busy room or a party, it doesn't matter what the context is. They said it felt like it was just he and I in the universe.
Wow.
Everyone that I talk to, and these people don't all know each other, of course. It's been a smattering of people that pop up. So in a sense, it's kind of a good informal study that way, because I could just say, what was he like? And they all say that he had the ability to just connect with someone in such a way that they believed that it was just him and them, and they shared a special connection. And he could do that apparently almost instantaneously. And I think that it's that quality that really was kind of his genius and his talent in the field. And I think that people who have, even if it's not to that degree, but that sensibility about them, that genuineness of connection, and it's slippery. It's something that can't be measured in like STEM science or natural science, but it's a quality that also can't be faked. Yeah. And I think that clients especially, or others, can pick that up pretty quickly. It's like, and whatever that is, Freud struggled with that. He ended up calling it transference. But if you look at the old literature, he early on, you can find him talking about telepathic transference. He was trying to explain this mysterious connection in relationship that happened that apparently he was good at as well. At other times he used, given the technology of the time, the old phones to talk about transference, the old ones. And so it's a mysterious quality, but that I think that it's that quality of Lang that speaks through all of his work. That's kind of one of his largest talents and gifts, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think Milton Erickson also people talked about that with him.
One of his students was a teacher of mine, and actually, I've never thought about this, but he said when he first met him, he like knocked on the door or something to that effect. You could ask him. His name's Ron Alexander.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, he said Oh, there you go. Right on. So he said he knocked on the door, and that's like the last thing he remembered until he sort of came to again that this he had such a way of it's like hypnosis could be induced immediately somehow.
Yeah, he called it Rossi call it the general waking trance. And just this sort of thing where you can see it when your client is really in touch with you, and sometimes it takes you several weeks to do it, and Lang and Erickson do it in a finger snap. How fascinating! Although perhaps we do and we don't know, but certainly these things are a nature of, again, the organized, the complex system. It just organizes itself, and it does what it does because it does it. It doesn't do it because something is done.
Right. And in the same sense that you very well talk, how, mind and body are not separate. They're a unity in the same way that as individuals we're a unity, so are we interpersonally. And I think that people like, it sounds like Erickson or Lang or Freud probably had somehow a special gift for dialing into that really quickly. And I think probably I would be curious to know if Erickson was this way, but Lang had a massive caring capacity. He really he really cared. He was passionate, and he had a huge heart. I suspect that Freud did also. Was this true also of?
Yes, absolutely. Uh,
Right, right.
I mean, one lovely example with Erickson was there he was sitting in his wheelchair with, second onset polio, which he suffered from, with a
Oh,
woman
wow.
with a woman who was saying, "I've come to you because you're the best trauma therapist in the world, and I've got this terrible trauma and I can't cope." And he just said, "Madam, I've got to tell you, I'm not the best trauma therapist at all. You are. And could you please just share with me how you have coped all these years with all these terrible things that have happened to you, and I'll see if I can contribute something to assist." It's just sort of like, wow, talk about turning the tables and delivering self-efficacy. Bandura would have been proud, but it was before Bandura's time, and Erickson was doing this, and Lang doing all these extraordinary. I mean, some of the language I used to hear from him back in the, when before you were born. Oh dear, yeah, it just heightened, all through the Beatles and all that sort of stuff. We just went, wow, who could say that? And this caringness really,
Beyond
really
it,
heightens
we
my awareness.
don't really see that today very often. Some of the early stuff on Lang, going and sitting for countless hours in. Remember, back in the day, apparently, the curtains would be drawn in these wards because there was a light sensitivity due to the medications, or they'd be in cells, and he would go and sit with them in silence for hours and hours and hours with just that silent connection, whatever that is. And, by all accounts, there were some really interesting things that came out of that experience. And that kind of attention to the client, the person's experience, not even client, the human person coming first and everything else being second
Yeah,
or down further the list, it was profound
yeah.
with him.
And I mean, I've got a while over this complex system things. I explain it in my workshops in about an hour or so, and get
Mm.
people up doing things and walking around and just learning how complex systems are really simple. Complicated systems, now they're different, but this idea that you can make very small impacts and have very large outcomes.
Yeah.
Is such a,
Hmm.
and that just idea coming from mathematics is a beautiful and encouraging thing, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's another kind of assumption is, a lot of, yeah, there are small things that really can produce a huge difference. It depends on uh, the person, but it's not. Again, it's another like thing that we don't have to believe 100% that, well, someone going to see a therapist is going to be expensive. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be. Sometimes it is.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes just a small shift
Mm.
in perspective, and it's almost miraculous how people, can turn around, or this system, as you refer to it, kind of takes care of itself.
Mm.
Everything on the planet seeks wholeness and wellness. There's nothing out there that, including us, as destructive as humans are, that are seeking destruction for destruction's sake.
Yeah. Yeah.
The attempts may be somewhat convoluted and perverted, and there's destructive outcomes, but everything inherently kind of seeks to organize itself around wholeness and wellness.
I
So
find
small
that.
things can produce a huge difference, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you just have to look at, after 4 or 5 years of studying the DNA and how it expresses itself and how it's organized and manages itself. Uh, I'm convinced exactly that. Just relax a little bit, and in fact, the more you relax, the more these systems organize themselves in a wholeness that is beneficial. Sometimes it just goes for homeostasis and survives, but there really is, every time you let go, there seems to be a gratitude from the body saying, "Oh, thank God you've got out of the way," and things reorganize themselves from right down within the middle of us, the DNA, out to the entire social system, and who knows what that's doing on a universal
Well,
level.
what do you think about this? Is just a idea, or I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this. If perhaps one variable in the equation, as it were, let's say, to get an individual or to help or to assist someone in becoming more aware or more in conscious contact with their connection to other things, with their fundamental wholeness, individually, bodily, socially, from a more physiological or perspective. Would you say that that produces some beneficial effects of some kind? Or
Yeah, yeah.
seems like you're kind of alluding to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're seeing it in the general experiments in this sort of psychosocial genomic manner, that when people take those sorts of approaches and embrace themselves, embrace others, and embrace their environment, that we're seeing the production of the body then turns around and reduces its inflammation, and it clears out its oxidative stress, and it coagulates the blood. I mean, it's quite fascinating.
Well, yeah, because you said relax into it, and like relaxing into something is a way of taking something up or perceiving something. And so it seems like there's some sense of conscious contact or more conscious contact or something like that. But then do you think that the reverse proposition might be true then, that the more we think of ourselves as not, or the less conscious contact we have, or the more we take ourselves up as brain, mind, body, or self and others, or things that are more disparate. If things are a fundamental unity, both individually and connected collectively, then I would think that the reverse of that may be a source of pathos, of pathology.
Absolutely. I certainly believe this in my understanding and feelings, but we're seeing it in the research.
Really?
The body will move towards homeostasis if that's to just survivable level in a disturbed state. But when given a relax, when given a comforted, when given an interpersonal opportunity, it will move beyond just homeostasis, more towards well-being and wholeness. But it's again, this thing we talked about, the immune system. When in doubt, just survive. And actually, the other thing that does seem to occur in the work I do looking at suicide, which I spend a lot of focus on, is that then you move either into an excessively chaotic state or an excessively rigid state, and you then move into a state of where destruction on all levels, from cell all the way up to entire being through suicide, becomes a possibility. And that's what I think I'm going to see when I grab a hold of your book. I'm over in the States in a little while, so I'll probably grab one.
Oh, really?
When I get
Where are you
there.
going?
I'm doing at the Erickson conference, not the Erickson conference in California, in LA in December. So I
Oh, really? Stay in touch with me. I'm in Thousand Oaks. You said I lived in Seattle. I live in Thousand Oaks, California.
Oh, okay.
I'm right by Los Angeles.
Oh, I might have some time to drop by. We're there for days and days and days. But
yeah, I was thinking about going to that. I got an invite for it, or the notice or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, because I've had an interest in hypnosis and things like that. It's just never been developed in my work. And so he's someone who clearly is a luminary, Erickson, who I just haven't been able or didn't track for whatever reasons. But yeah, I'm interested. He sounds fascinating.
Yeah, we can talk some more about it. And I'm just looking at the old time ticking away there. I want to just sort of get into a bit of a wrap up. It seems that people have about a 40 to 50 minute tolerance level for viewing. We could talk for hours and hours and hours. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
Just now, maybe in a bit of a wrap up, one of the things, I mean, certainly your book there is talking about the nature of destruction, but that probably doesn't, cheer people up an enormous amount broadly. Is there a rounding? Is there a collection? I mean, you've already alluded to a lot of really interesting things, but just as a message, is there a particular message that you would like to point us towards, or perhaps indicate as something that you're a particular point you're making that encourages, or the sort of leads me to relax and be calm and self-organize?
I don't know that it's as easy as just like sort of one or 2 points, or even like bullet point. I wish I could do that, but it's it's like, hey, there's these 3 things, and then you never have to worry about anything
Yeah,
again.
yeah,
But
no.
I think that one of the things that I try to point towards in the book is that if someone is experiencing some form of distress, no matter what that may be, or no matter in what degree that may be, that it isn't just something that exists in the person's mind. And I find that with a lot of the people that I work with, that there is a certain relief. Certainly this isn't the only thing, but there's a certain relief that one has when he or she says, this madness is not a private madness. This is something that is, there is a lot of destructiveness out there in the world, culturally, socially, globally. And, I'm experiencing some of that as a kind of like psychic background radiation, if you will. But that it's not just there. Any form of distress exists solely somehow in individuals' malfunctioning brain organ. And the second thing I think is that it's not neurologically based. I think that people tend to feel better about that, and especially these days, people are reading about all of the really disappointing information about psychiatric medication and what that does. The research around that is pretty heinous. I don't think is too strong of a word. And so people want to know what really works. And, I think another thing that's really hopefully helpful about that is that we know what causes what becomes labeled as mental health concerns. And we get this from a whole body of research, probably the most recent and best being, of course, the Adverse Childhood Event, the ACE studies,
Yes.
that we know that developmental stress and or trauma are what produces these things. And so that, in my mind, and a lot of the people I work with find this helpful, is that we know what causes it. It is not a mysterious hypothesis floating around like the chemical imbalance theory, which has since been just tossed out, or some kind of weird, mysterious thing. We have some really good evidence that it's developmental stress and or trauma that causes not only these mental health, what becomes labeled as mental health disorders or something like that, but also chemical dependency. And also what was interesting, particularly in the ACE studies, uh, is a whole host of just diseases of the body that really are diseases, unlike what's in the DSM, that really are physiological diseases are related. There was a strong, strong correspondence between ACE scores and that. So those 3 things really quickly, people I work with have found those to be really helpful, and I hope people will take some of that away. And one idea, I guess, that I'll end on that isn't discussed a lot, but that R.D. Laing talks a lot about this. He picks this up from Carl Jung, is the idea of metanoia, which is a Greek word. My Greek friends tell me it's pronounced something more like metania, but I don't speak Greek, so it's perfectly okay to call it metanoia according to our dictionary. So, but it means, basically what it means in its etymology is like a change of mind, but what they're really looking at is it's a process reaching wholeness.
Yeah.
It's a process, it could be called spiritual, life, existential process that's seeking to reach its conclusion. That's how Laing saw schizophrenia and every other form of distress. It tends to be how I see it. So I think people get some relief from knowing that self-destructive processes, any form of distressing state of mind, is a process that's larger than them, working itself through to its end. And that's where Laing, of course, got his idea for the Philadelphia Association, which is still around in the UK, Soteria houses, therapeutic communities where this process could work itself out without being interrupted necessarily by medicine or other modalities or interventions. And sure enough, the research around these therapeutic communities is wonderful that they actually work really well too. So that's as brief as I can
Oh no, that's lovely.
make it.
I mean,
Sorry.
I was just hearing.
It's hard to.
Oh no, it's beautiful. And it was really lovely. I mean, no, you can't put these things. If you could put it down to 3 bullet points, then life would be easy. What's the wonderful thing? I have a slide when I do my brain studies. If the brain was really easy enough to understand, then it wouldn't be complex enough to be able to understand itself. So, but
yeah, I know. And aside from the brain, in some of my presentations I do, it's kind of like the brain is undoubtedly one of the most complex things that humans have encountered. But if you think that's complicated, imagine a network of social relationships or social reality. It's just it's fascinating to think about.
And I guess if I wanted to summarize all that lovely stuff you said, a bit from interpersonal neurobiology, I mean, we are our stuff is embodied. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. It's relational,
right?
And it's not always, but it's not the nouns that we're looking at. It's the verbs. It's the activity, the expression, the nature of it, which is what you're saying, the qualitative stuff.
And I would toss in a non-religious, non-New Agey sense, I think that there's an element of the mystical.
Yes.
Not just biopsychosocial, spiritual, but yes. When we say that we're connected to something larger, Bion talks about capital O, the ultimate unknown, unknowable, and all the processes that occur therein. Heidegger talks about capital B, being, the possibility of all possibility. There's a sense of if we're in the unknown and we're a fundamental unity, then and I'm connected to that somehow. Then there's, I hope, a sense of the mystical in there, also connected to the wholeness and not knowing, a lot, and how we are with that, if we're in faith or if we're not in,
And that really does bring it round beautifully. So I'm just going to say thank you. Hang on, we'll say goodbye in a sec, but everybody, I hope you've really enjoyed that talk with Brent. I have fabulous. Go get his book, this wonderful thing, Elements of Self-Destruction. Amazon has got it there, and look into this. We've got to know so much more. So thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much. That was a great conversation. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye everybody.